Hi, this is Steve at the Listening Post, and today I'd like to talk about Graham Parsons, a country rock pioneer whose American cosmic music brought forth an entire generation of country rock bands and albums throughout the early to mid 70s. Graham Parsons worked with the Byrds and participated on their album Sweetheart of the Rodeo, a country rock classic that came out in 1968. He hung out with the Rolling Stones and influenced many of their country sounding songs, including Wild Horses, Sweet Virginia, Dead Flowers. And he formed the Flying Burrito Brothers with Chris Hillman of the Byrds, released two classic albums, then introduced the music public to the talents of Emmylou Harris, and she performed with his band The Falling Angels on their two albums. Graham Parsons was born in 1946 in Winter Haven, Florida. His family moved to Georgia, and he spent most of his early years growing up there. He decided to become a musician after attending an Elvis Presley concert. When he was 10 years old, he formed a band called the Pacers, which performed Buddy Holly covers. When he was 12 years old, he created a band called the Legends, which included Jim Stafford and Kent LaVoe, who would later become famous as Lobo. In 1959, his father, who was a well-decorated Air Force ace from World War II, committed suicide, and his family moved back to Florida, where his mother remarried into a family that made much money in the Florida citrus industry, and this basically meant that Graham Parsons was never going to have any financial worries the rest of his life. His family set up a trust fund for him, and this is critical because it allowed him to follow his muse, which was country music, as opposed to performing what was popular during that time, which was loud psychedelic rock. Graham Parsons never was very popular or successful in his lifetime, but having the luxury of being able to perform what he wanted to perform and not being financially limited like many other musicians are, he was able to develop this style of music that basically reintroduced young audiences to country and made country cool again. In 1963, Parsons formed a group called the Shilohs, which performs folk music in the style of the Kingston Trio, and they even performed in Greenwich Village of New York City, including an appearance at a club called the Bitter End. 1965, tragedy struck a second time. On the day of his high school graduation, his mother died of cirrhosis of the liver, a result of her severe alcoholism. Parsons briefly attended Harvard University, became close friends with his freshman advisor, the Reverend James Ellison Thomas, who would later perform the wedding ceremonies at Parsons' wedding. And he met a musician named John News, a guitarist in a local band called the Trolls. It was News that turned Parsons on to the Bakersfield sound of Merle Haggard and Buck Owens. Parsons dropped out of Harvard after one semester, and in 1966, him and John News moved to New York City and formed the International Submarine Band. They recorded a couple singles for Columbia Records, which failed to chart. And then in '67, the band relocated to Los Angeles. They signed a contract with Lee Hazelwood's LHI label. Lee Hazelwood is best known for some of the duets he performed with Nancy Sinatra in the mid-'60s. The International Submarine Band released an album called Safe at Home, which contained one of Parsons' early songs, Luxury Liner. And on bass, he had Chris Etheridge, who would later go on to join Parsons in the Flying Burrito Brothers. However, the record's release was delayed, and while the band was waiting for it to come out, they broke up. And it was later in 1968 that Parsons was invited by Chris Hillman, the bassist for the Byrds, to audition with the band. Chris Hillman recalls, "We were hiring a keyboard player, but instead we got George Jones in a rhinestone suit." Parsons convinced the Byrds to record their next album in Nashville, and that resulted in the album Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which came out in August 1968. It included several Parsons originals, including Hickory Wind and 100 Years From Now. And the album featured several Nashville session players, including Lloyd Green on pedal steel guitar and Clarence White, who would later go on to become a member of the Byrds. Before leaving Nashville, the Byrds performed a two-song set at the Grand Ole Opry. They played a Merle Haggard song called Sing Me Back Home. They were supposed to follow it with another Merle Haggard song, but mid-set Parsons changed his mind and decided he wanted to perform Hickory Wind instead. The band received fierce criticism from the Nashville community, including a DJ named Ralph Emery. And in response, Parsons and McGuinn co-wrote the song Drugstore Truck Driving Man, which Joan Baez performed at Woodstock. The album did come out in August 1968, but Parsons was still under contract to LHI Records, and Lee Hazelwood fought in court against the Byrds being able to release an album with Parsons on it. So several of the songs that Parsons had sang on had to be redone with Roger McGuinn on vocals. He did perform two songs on the album, Hickory Wind and You're Still on My Mind. In 2003, Columbia released an extended version that included all the original Parsons vocals, and that added four more songs: The Christian Life, Life in Prison, You Don't Miss Your Water, and one of my favorites, 100 Years From Now. And this is the extended legacy edition of Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which is the one to get. 1968, while the Byrds were touring in England, Parsons became friends with Keith Richards and Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. And when the band was going to leave for a tour of South Africa, Parsons dropped out of the group, and he said that he objected to the apartheid policies, but most people think he just wanted to hang out in England with the Rolling Stones. He became good friends with Keith Richards, and they may have co-composed Wild Horses together. In 1968, towards the end of the year, Parsons returned to California, and he and Chris Hillman formed the Flying Burrito Brothers. They shared a bachelor pad in the San Fernando Valley that they dubbed Burrito Manor, and they co-wrote a couple of classic tunes that would be included on the first album, including Sin City, Christine's Tune, and Hot Burrito No. 2. Bassist Chris Etheridge from the International Submarine Band joined the group, and he co-composed Hot Burrito No. 1. The group also included Sneaky Pete Kleino on pedal steel and Byrds drummer Michael Clark. I've got this compilation, and it's the anthology for the Flying Burrito Brothers. Includes both of their solo albums. The first album came out in 1969, The Gilded Palace of Sin, which is widely regarded as a country rock classic. It's got a couple of covers on it, The Dark End of the Street and Do Right Woman, a big hit for Aretha Franklin that David Crosby is singing high harmony on. Their second album, they went on tour to promote the first album, and at that point Chris Etheridge dropped out of the group and Bernie Leadon joined, and he would later go on to become a founding member of the Eagles. The band opened for the Rolling Stones at the Altamont Music Festival in 1969. The Stones were promoting their Let It Bleed album, and they decided at the end of the tour to do this free concert in Altamont, just outside of San Francisco. It was supposed to be in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, but they couldn't get the permits, so they moved the concert out to Altamont. And Jerry Garcia may have suggested that they hire the Hells Angels to provide security for the show. That didn't turn out to be such a good idea. Somebody was knifed and killed in the middle of the Rolling Stones set. The concert was featured in a film called Gimme Shelter, and the Flying Burrito Brothers were included. One of their songs was included in the concert. April 1970, they released their second album, Burrito Deluxe. Neither album sold very well, although the band did develop a following among other musicians, which led to a outbreak of country music in the first half of the 70s. The album does contain a song called Lazy Days and High Fashion Queen and Cody Cody. Three excellent songs. And it's got the cover of Wild Horses, which had not actually come out yet. Graham Parsons got a hold of a demo of the Rolling Stones' Sticky Finger album and decided to do his own version of that song. He left the group in 1970. Chris Hillman recorded 2 more albums with the Flying Burrito Brothers before he left in 1972 to join Stephen Stills in Manassas. By the end of '70, Graham Parsons had signed with A&M Records to record a solo album. He recorded a couple of tracks with producer Terry Melcher, which were never released. Then he moved back to Europe and hung out with the Rolling Stones in France while they were working on the Exile on Main Street album, and he sings harmony on the song Sweet Virginia. In '71, he returned to the United States. He was performing at a show with the Flying Burrito Brothers in Washington, D.C., and Chris Hillman suggested he check out a female singer named Emmylou Harris, who was performing at a club nearby. So he went and saw her show and afterwards invited her out to L.A. to record his first album. Also in the group was Rick Gretsch on bass. He had performed with Blind Faith and Traffic. And 3 members of Elvis Presley's band, including guitarist James Burton, who was already very well known for the work he did with Ricky Nelson in the late 50s, and Barry Tatian, who would form a group later on called Barry and the Remains. They wanted Merle Haggard to produce the album, but he turned them down. They did get Merle Haggard's engineer, Hugh Davis. The album was called GP. It was released in January 1973. Contains several Graham Parsons originals and some covers, including Tom Paul Glasser's Streets of Baltimore, Joyce Alsop's We'll Sweep Out the Ashes in the Morning, and a song by the Jay Giles Band, Cry One More Time. Graham Parsons and the Fallen Angels went out on tour. I've got both these Graham Parsons albums on this Rhino box, the complete reprise sessions, which is a nice way to get a hold of that material. They went out on tour in 1973. James Burton was replaced on guitar by Jock Bartley, a Colorado-based guitarist who would later go on to form the band Firefall. The tour was managed by Phil Kaufman, who Graham Parsons had met when Phil Kaufman was working with the Rolling Stones back in 1968. One of the shows from this tour was later released on an album called Graham Parsons and the Fallen Angels Live 1973. After the tour was completed, they returned to the studio and recorded one other album called The Return of the Grievous Angel. That includes a duet with Emmylou Harris called Love Hurts, one of their classic recordings. When the album was finished, Graham Parsons celebrated by taking a vacation at the Joshua Tree National Monument, where he was found dead September 19, 1973, on an overdose of morphine and tequila. His body was supposed to be shipped back to New Orleans for burial. However, Phil Kaufman, his manager, stole his body at the Los Angeles airport and transported it back to the Joshua Tree National Monument, where he attempted to cremate it by dumping 5 gallons of gasoline into the open coffin and dousing it with a match. Kaufman was later charged with a misdemeanor theft of a coffin and fined $708. Grievous Angel was released in January 1974, peaked at 195 on the Billboard charts. 3 of the tracks from that session were later released in 1976 on an album called Sleepless Nights. A couple of live albums have come out in the meantime. This is the Flying Burrito Brothers live at the Avalon Ballroom in San Francisco, 1969. And also Hippo Records released an album called Late Show, November 7th, 1970. This does not feature Graham Parsons. This band is featuring Bernie Leadon and Chris Hillman. In 1999, Emmylou Harris organized a tribute concert, and that was documented on the album Return of the Grievous Angel, a tribute to Graham Parsons. And in 2008, Emmylou Harris was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was Emmylou Harris that basically brought attention to Graham Parsons after his death and continued to champion his cause. She covered several of his songs on her solo albums, including Hickory Wind, Sin City, Luxury Liner. One of her early songs, Boulder to Birmingham, is a tribute to Graham Parsons from her '75 album, Pieces of the Sky. She also did a song called The Road in 2011 on her album Hard Bargain, which is a tribute to Graham Parsons. Well, that's all I got. I just wanted to bring attention to this, influential musician. And once again, all this information is included in the essay on the Totally Guitars website. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you again next time.